cut decisions, and that she believes that the result of these cuts will mean more harm to children. What do you say to that?
Well, we don't agree with that, that the cuts will result in more harm in children. The whole purpose of kind of the funding reorientation has been actually to focus more on those children that we think are at most harm. But I'm happy to, Darren, have you got any further comments you want to? Okay.
So in particular, the Children's Commissioner referred to Dame Karen Patassi's report talking about the importance of creating a net, and she believes that these cuts will mean that there are holes in that net for our tamariki. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, I just think that's opinion at this point, and we are doing a refocus on our contracting and our funding. We are focusing on those children at most need. And so, that's where we're driving this. I'm not sure how anyone could come to the conclusion that there are holes in the net. Because, even if that is the thought that there could be, no time has passed to prove that.
And probably just to add to that as well, is whatever decision we make, we would move money from something to something else. So it is one bucket, it is one set of resources, so we're having to make conscious decisions. When we estimated the changes and the reductions or the discontinuation of services, we identified, based on the contracts that we were changing, that there was going to be an impact potentially of over, around 1,300 impact on children directly. When we reviewed the volumes versus what was actually being delivered, that reduced significantly down from that. But noting also, as Adrian said, we also purchased new services. So what we didn't have, what services we discontinued or reduced there, we purchased new services in different other areas as well. So we think either on, to your comment, that we were actually meeting those needs. So the comments from the ICM or the comments from the Commission, I don't know what that's based on.
So this will be my last one on this, and then to Kahurangi. We have heard from social service providers. I have put this to the Minister. The Minister has come back and said, because there are gaps that have been created, that's what we are hearing from the social service providers whose services have been discontinued, where there is no like service to be able to transition their whānau tamariki to, that then creates a gap. The Minister has said, we never said there'd be like for like services. So there has been a decision to not contract for certain things and to shift that somewhere else. But in the process of doing that, what we are hearing is it has created gaps. Do you disagree with that?
It'll be gaps in what might currently exist in services.
For need?
Well, it depends on which needs you are trying to meet. So if we are trying to focus our resources and our investment on the needs of children that we know, that have come to our attention and those needs. So we are redirecting those resources there. So that's what we know. So services would have reduced. There would be differences in different communities. For example, we were purchasing some services for adults that we could not see any direct value for that was going to be delivered to the children in our care.
Like parenting.
And if we're funding that, then my point is that we're not funding something else that should have been directed towards children in our care.
Supplementary card.
Thank you. So as my colleague Willow Jean had said, both Mana Mokopuna and the Independent Children's Monitor have raised serious concerns about prevention service cuts and have said that they will likely weaken the safety nets for tamariki. So Mana Mokopuna actually has explicitly called for documented evidence to show how these decisions are being made and their impact on tamariki. So why hasn't Oranga Tamariki provided the evidence? Are we just sitting here supposed to take your word that there are no gaps, when mana mokopuna and the Independent Children's Monitor are saying the opposite?
Look, I think, I think Andrew's answered the question in terms we don't necessarily agree with Mana Mokopuna's view, first point. Second point, we have provided information to both monitors, and it sounds like to me as part of our routine check-ins and work with both the ICM and Mana Mokopuna, this is something that we can pick up with them. What I'll also add is across to an earlier question, just to close something off around the, Mr. Chair, around the shift in budgets. This is a mixed category appropriation. So that gives an ability to flex how we provide services within that mixed category appropriation. In terms of the dollars we spent and the dollars we're forecasting, it's actually about the same. So to Darren's point, 457 million circa last year, give or take. So, sorry, excuse me, 455, and the coming year, 467. What is sitting behind that prevention and early intervention is early support and prevention, intensive response, early support, prevention and intensive response. So a range of different interventions around intensity. And what this is about is ensuring that actually we've got the right level of intensity against need.
Supplementary, Jenny.
So when you're speaking about that, are you talking about children in state care or children still in their whānau?
Yeah, so it covers both. So it covers both those children that are in state care and those that come to the attention of Oranga Tamariki.
So when the minister stated that Oranga Tamariki would be funding children in state care, nothing more, nothing less, was she incorrect?
Look, I'm not familiar with that comment from the minister.
It's pretty clear on the record. She clearly stated that she would only be funding children in state care. Are you saying that that's incorrect and you're still funding children outside of state care?
Yeah, so I'm saying two things. Actually, what the funding arrangements are. One, to the question is probably better directed to the minister rather than me.
In your reprioritisation or shifting, has there been a shift towards more to state care and outside of more towards the state care in that redirection you spoke about?
No, not necessarily. I think we're opening up more pathways, though, particularly around the youth justice area. So that's one is around finding the mentoring support, victim support services. We've also in procurement for that. We've got other support services around sexual harm and abuse as well. So there's victim advocacies around the court system as well. So it hasn't just stayed in the care arena. It has actually spread across. In some areas, we've kind of got more focus in the care. Probably to also note with you as well, we also run individual care placements as well. So we have individual contracts that we move into fees for service. Those are quite expensive ones where we're not being able to meet the needs of the child in existing care provider capacity. So we might need to purchase specific need-based kind of contracting. So that's where you'll see the shift and changes. We're meeting the needs of children.
So when you got that that change to be more value for money or making, I mean, there were some comments around about not wasting money or giving it to providers if they weren't using it. So when that reprioritisation done, was there any lens to be more focused? What was the direction you were given in order to get better value for money from the minister?
Look, I can't comment specifically about that direction. But as public servants, we want to make sure that we're getting the best value for money.
But if you did it, you must have known what you were told.
Yeah, no.
Let her finish.
Yeah.
Defending the minister.
Sorry, the question was around the direction. The direction from the minister was around our focus on safety. And I think that also goes to the comments from Mana Mokopuna around how we focus on safety. What you'll also see in the comments that both Mana Mokopuna and the ICM said in their select committee is around how we respond to reports of concern. And what we've noticed over time is an increase in our reports of concern. So what are the right interventions there in terms of more intensive response when we have a report of concern? So our focus has been on safety, and our focus, as Darren has said, is on youth justice. Both areas are areas that we know we've got pressures and need to respond to.
Supplementary poll.
The Aotearoa Tamariki came up with a returning home from care report. And my question has to do with when Rangatahi and Tamariki are at home and when they're still considered in state custody. My first question is, are they still considered to be in state custody even if they have already been returned to home?
Yes, so in some
Yeah.
situations, children will remain under the custody of the chief executive once they've returned home for a period of time to make sure that there is ongoing stability before we apply to the court to say, actually, this mum, this dad, this family are doing well in the care of their child again now. There are the right support networks around and there's no longer a need for a child to remain in our custody. But when we talk about return home, we are talking about children who are still in the custody of the chief executive, having transitioned back home after a period in care.
Okay. In addition to that question, the report said that safeguards and supports are not always there for these Tamariki and Rangatahi. The question is, how much support and care is required of Oranga Tamariki as opposed to the support and care that Tamariki and Rangatahi have from their own home because they're placed back in their home? Could you speak to that, please?
Yes, I can. So the first thing I just point out is we know from our safety of children care data, there's actually been a reduction in concerns and harm for children who are returning home. But these are situations where children have often experienced harm previously in the home environment, and work has been done to address those concerns. The kind of chronic things that we're dealing with, that our social workers in the real world are dealing with, are really significant substance abuse in parents, adult mental health issues, housing instability, all of those issues. And they are issues that require responses not just from Oranga Tamariki. And actually one of the things that the monitor said in his return home report, was that for this group of children and families in particular, a comprehensive interagency response is needed to ensure that the safety that has been created back in the home environment for that child can be sustained over time. So we're looking at a whole bunch of things. It's building parenting capability that will be happening while a child might still be out of home, but it's also addressing the underlying factors that make it hard for those parents to parent safely.
Okay. It's such a...
New question for Aotearoa.
Oh, sorry, this is just a supplementary.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you. I do have a new question though as well. So what I'm hearing, what you're telling us is that you don't share the same concerns, that there isn't the safety net. And so you're saying that the measures that Oranga Tamariki are taking are ensuring that no child will be left without the necessary support. Because I'm not sure if you know, but in the House, the Minister had to correct a statement that she made about saying that the reduction in services to frontline contractors was going back into the same bucket, and it wasn't. And this is what I'm hearing from you, that actually we're just moving things around. We're not taking things away from prevention. What we're doing is we're leaving a great safety net. If we're taking something away from contracting, we're replacing it with something else. And I just want to know, and this is the assurances that you guys are giving us today. So I want to know if there are more children left vulnerable as a result of these costs, who is going to take responsibility and accountability for those outcomes? Because what is your timeline for reviewing the impact of these decisions?
Can I just make some comments about that first part to your question?
Yeah.
Because I don't think we are saying that the security net, the safety net exists in the way that it completely needs to. What we are saying is we need to continually evaluate to make sure that the investment that we have provides that coverage of support.
So maybe I didn't make myself super clear. It was when Darren was talking and said that he was confident that if a service had been disestablished or unfunded, then there was another one that was picking up that work and making sure that safety net was there. So it sounds like you're really happy with how those contracting services are going and how those frontline services are. So if you're really happy with it and you know there are things that you want to make changes with, but who, if more children are left vulnerable, is going to be accountable for the outcomes of the decisions that are being made that are affecting our children.
Absolutely. I think the question is around accountability for making such decisions. And every day we have to be accountable for those decisions. As I have said to you, to fund something means to say I can't fund something else. And that those are decisions you have to make. You're weighing up this one or that one. So when we're making those decisions, we're looking across the country. We're looking at where we know demands and needs have come through. We're looking at volumes of reports of concern, the kinds of things. The other thing that we're aware about is that children that come into care or into our attention come with multiple issues and factors. There's not one risk factor. The risk factor may be safety that might bring them into our notice, but there'll be issues like unstable housing, mental health around, access to family violence or visibility of family. So you have to take all those factors. A general system, a general service let's say at a basic kind of low family support need will be great to be able to identify support for that family, but then they need to refer it to an intensive service. And a service that will be able to deal with family violence or sexual violence.
So who takes accountability?
Well, that's what we're having to do. We're
And
having
you're
to
saying you're
make,
doing that every day?
we have to make those decisions to make sure that if there was a service at this level, is there another service that could go into at the next intensive level? So we fund it.
Even though the funding's been cut?
We're not cutting. We're not.
Look at the vote.
We're not cutting funding. As we said, we continue to fund over $500 million in contracted spend. But we are having
Thing
to.
that the minister
let
had to
him
retract
let him
in the
finish.
No, we
Let him
won't be
finish.
retracting that. We are definitely spending over $500 million in contracted spend. That sits with an operational level, not with the minister. That's what I'm operating from at the moment. So I can give you a surety right now that $500 million and more than that is being contracted into community contracted spend.
Look, I have a question. The committee notes the findings of the Ombudsman in the report, Children in Care Complaints to the Ombudsman 2019 to 2023. How have you engaged the Ombudsman in response to that report?
So I'll make some initial, the responsibility has shifted over the course of the year, so I'll make some initial comments. So just in relation to that report, it reflected essentially, I think the report talks about over that period, the Ombudsman had received around 2,000 inquiries around Oranga Tamariki, of which 117 investigations resulted in findings. Around 61 of them found areas where our practice was deficient over that 4-year period, and made a range of recommendations. We didn't wait for the report, so every time a finding or an investigation is released, it makes a series of recommendations. We respond in real time with the actions that we are taking in response. So a number of the recommendations that we've talked about, the ones that we're progressing, the ones that have closed, changes we've made in our practice, speak directly to the insights that were raised in the Ombudsman's investigations and reports. So when that report, that summary report came through, we looked closely at what the Ombudsman was saying. We accept his view that there was significantly more work to do. We've been very clear about that ourselves today. But the areas that he had identified, when we look at the work that we already had underway, we had a reasonable degree of confidence that the actions we were already taking were speaking to those issues. And also, as the Ombudsman's report says itself, he recognises that changes had been made by Oranga Tamariki along the way, notwithstanding that he also acknowledged that there's significant more work to do.
Supplementary on that, what mechanisms have you put in place to record performance against actions being taken to respond to those issues identified in that report?
Sorry.
Look, I probably touched on some of the answers earlier on, but across the whole suite of reports that we get in terms of ICM, Mana Mokopuna, Ombudsman, we've got a team in place that tracks each of the recommendations. That's why I'm able to give you the figures on where we're at with each of them, and we work through. Again, to Nicolette's point, we don't sit on our hands waiting for the reports. We've got a whole practice quality approach that we've got in place. And as I said earlier, looking forward, I think there is benefit for the system around how we theme up those themes and make sure we're addressing the themes in total across our care system.
Your question, Kahorangi.
Oh, thank you. So mine is about transparency in outcomes. And so without transparent mechanisms to track progress, how does Oranga Tamariki demonstrate accountability and effectiveness in addressing systemic issues highlighted in recent oversight reports? So the Mana Mokopuna report on monitoring places of detention highlighted severe issues like staffing shortages, inconsistent care, and inadequate training. So I'm really interested to know what Oranga Tamariki is doing to implement a transparent tracking system so that we can monitor the improvements in this area.
Yeah, I'll start off and then, so look, there's a couple of things in your question. One is around tracking, one is around transparency, and the other one is about outcomes. So I'll start at the outcomes in the first instance. So look, I think we need to be better as a system around the outcomes. We have had a very strong attempt in terms of our outcomes, in terms of our new strategic directions document to note the outcomes and put processes in place to actually track our interventions towards outcomes. Within that, I think that's going to be helpful in terms of your earlier question around as we make changes across the system, in terms of Darren's point, the contractual change, or as we make practice change, that we're able to track whether those interventions are actually leading to the outcomes. And in terms of our accountability with each of the monitors, they come in, and I think my view is that it's very transparent around how we're tracking against the various recommendations. You've received that transparency in terms of the Mana Mokopuna, in terms of the ICM report, many of the things they've said.
Which you don't agree with a lot of them.
No, I didn't say we didn't agree with. I said some of the things, specific things. The bit, and to that point, the bit that I say that we wouldn't agree with is that there hasn't been progress against the national care standards. And I might leave Nicolette to talk about that. But finally, are we doing work to improve Oranga Tamariki? And my answer to that is yes, we absolutely are. And that has been a flavour of all of the conversations, today. And just to refresh, and to be clear, we're taking a very strong focus on safety, around 21 priority areas that match our measures, but actually really focusing at the core of what we do. We've also heard from Tasha Penny around the very extensive program that's going on in our youth justice facilities, an area that we've identified, and the monitors have identified the need for improvement, and there's a strong practice framework. Nicolette, I might just hand over to you just around the national care standards.
Sure. So I think what our chief executive said at the beginning was really true. There can be no tolerance for less than 100%. There's no room for error. But we do also have to recognise that the oversight legislation also includes a focus on continuous improvement. From the outset, the Independent Children's Monitor and the conversations, I was previously responsible for that direct relationship. The conversations we had was there are 80 particular components across the whole of the care standards. It's really difficult to evidence. So pick the ones that make the most difference. Sure. Choose some of those, focus on those, see improvement of those. So in the 23-24 year, we identified 16 lead indicators. We increased that to 21 lead indicators this year. We've published our own self-assurance, and we have in the 23-24 year, we saw a significant uplift across a number of those standards, and we've sustained that uplift. There is more to do, and I know that's something I say a lot because it's true. But if I just give a couple of examples, this year in our own self-assurance, we found that from our sampling of more than 700 in-depth case file reviews, 90% of children have a current needs assessment. That's an improvement from about 70% 2 years ago. 92% have a current plan that actively addresses the safety needs of those children. 90% and 88% respectively have health and education needs being addressed, and we need to do that together with our colleagues. And there's been an improvement in our collaboration across agencies. The other insights we have is the experiences of young people themselves and what they tell us about their care experience. And when in our most recent survey, which is a year or so ago now, 98% of those young people were telling us that they felt well looked after by the adults who cared for them, and 92% felt settled. And we see in our current data that the numbers of placement changes that are happening for children, which is one of the most, if you hear from survivors of abuse and care, was one of the most awful experiences, this constant sense of not belonging, that has changed significantly over the last number of years. So I'm not here to say things are perfect, but I'm also, I have to be fair to my very hard-working social workers too, to say that actually change is happening.
Maru Mino, supplementary.
To the Ombudsman's report, and there are 6 or 7 points here, but I wanted to pull out 2 if I can and just ask for some further conversation, which is issues around uplifts of children. So these are complaints from to the Ombudsman, and the failure to respect and engage with Māori in a culturally appropriate or competent way. It just can you just talk a little bit more to those? Nicola.
So actually, this is a situation where monitoring works. So the role of the monitor, the Ombudsman did case review of Section 78s for babies who were brought into care, and it followed the very public and difficult experience in the Hawke's Bay. They pointed to some significant things about, I did mention these briefly earlier, a lack of early engagement with whānau, a lack of working collaboratively with partners, and particularly iwi and community partners. If I think about that case, one of the things that was clear was there were community partners who knew these families well and knew exactly what safe and unsafe looked like and how to support that. So we have significantly, if you look at the change, the reduction in babies who are removed from parents, it's significant. So yes, we've had 39 in the last 12 months who have come into our custody, but actually only 17 in the last 18 months were removed from hospital. And in most of those situations, they were removed to whānau care, and they were removed after quality time had been spent with mum and every effort was made to establish breastfeeding. So this is, for me, hand on heart, an area of practice that I know from how closely we look at it has changed substantially. And it's an example of when monitoring works well.
So is reverse uplifts like, I mean, that wasn't around in my time, that kind of language. I'm curious what it means now. And are they a thing? Like,
So,
sorry.
so it's not language we use.
Yeah.
We are in a situation where now, as children come into care, there is significant work done to identify whānau, whakapapa, care arrangements early. So actually, a lot of children move straight into whānau care. Our old practice was not so well done. And so there were children who had long-term care out of whānau, and as we tried to balance the right thing to do, there were situations where some of those care arrangements were changed. But we don't agree with the framing or the way that reverse uplift has been described in the public domain. That's not exactly the way that we would talk about it. Our practice and policy now is to work very closely and early on with whānau, with those who are providing care, even if that's not whānau, and with the child themselves, to be really clear about what is the long-term care arrangement that will best suit these children.
The sort of the iwi or provider groups, certainly their direct challenge to me and others is the 7AA changes came because of 2 reverse uplifts, you know, whatever the correct, is that true? Do you know that? Would you know that?
So I think
that brought about the sudden revelation that we should call everyone New Zealanders and Māori children and culture don't matter.
So I think we've been clear in our evidence before the tribunal and in the advice we've given to ministers and to the select committee that we were aware of some cases where in the early days of 7AA there may have been some attempts to get the balance right that may not have been as helpful for children. What I am really clear about is that the Minister has been clear to me that her overriding expectation is that the safety and well-being of children is paramount and is primary, and that's clear in our legislation.
Despite their culture.
And sitting alongside that are the principles of mana te maiti whakapapa whanaungatanga, which remain in the legislation and are defined in the legislation, as is the rights of children, as is a very clear hierarchy in the principles of legislation to, wherever possible, prevent children from being removed from their parents by providing support. But where children are needing to be removed from their parents, making sure that they can be cared for within whānau. So that is the framework under which underpins our practice framework, our practice approach, our practice policies and settings, and will remain.
Do you think culturally competent? Do you think across the social work band, and even do you think there's an culturally competent, like actually? And I mean, our history, you know, that goes back a little while. I'm just,
Look, I can say that it's embedded in our practice approach, it's embedded in our professional development. And it's also an expectation of registered social workers that they, in their own right, demonstrate that right. We have had to work hard to uplift that. We've had an organisational approach to uplifting cultural capability for all staff. And in our practice approach in particular, we took it right back to ko waio, who am I, where am I from, what are my cultural biases, what are my lenses that I bring into my work. And actually this, in the next few months, we'll be introducing and rolling out our core practice models for supporting Pacific children and Māori children. And, you know, if I think about the Huawei induction program, which we didn't have 2 years ago, we didn't have social workers who had fit for purpose induction. A whole focus on that is culturally responsive, inclusive, restorative practice. It's at the heart, it's embedded within our practice framework and approach.
Supplementary, Paulo.
Supplementary to Maria Mano's question about the complaints. In the report, Children in Care Complaints Received by the Ombudsman 2019 to 2023, we have talked about the complaints. The Ombudsman report also mentioned that there were evidences of good practice within Oranga Tamariki. Responding to that report as a whole, what engagements with the Ombudsman do you have planned? Because clearly that connection is an important one. So that's my supplementary.
So we can probably both speak to this, but actually regular engagement with all of our monitors is fundamental. It's about being able to give visibility of the work that we are doing and the changes that we are making, as well as having open and honest conversations about what needs to change. So we are in the process of kind of resetting some of those, I guess, for the new year, but those regular meetings happen routinely. And one of the things that we've committed to doing is providing more information about the work that I've shared today, the quality assurance insights, the practice insights that we see, so that it's not just about when a complaint happens and seeing that practice in isolation, but how do we contextualise that across what else we're seeing in practice and where things are shifting, but also still being real about where things we need to see that stretch growth. Yeah. I don't know if you want to add to that.
And look, just a comment that is certainly important for me is we need to do better in this space. And I think the Royal Commission, in terms of their report, recognise that having a strong complaint mechanism in place is important. And we also recognise that actually when someone's making a complaint, they're putting their hand up for help. And we need to be able to respond quickly and to get them that help. So I don't want to, step away that there is work that we need to do. Again, not to keep going back to Andrew's opening remarks, this is one of the areas we're focusing strong on because that we're not where we need to be.
Just want to ask one little supplementary.
Sure.
Yes. Okay, good. It's just in relation to Maria Meno's question. So you talked about some of the ways that you are helping staff be more culturally conscious. And we know that the 7AA repeal is quite likely to go through. And so I just want to know, how does Oranga Tamariki plan to demonstrate measurable outcomes in addressing these culturally procedural critical issues, to see how it actually is affecting the tamariki with the repeal of Section 7AA? So like, you've talked about some of the things that you've put in place to help the staff. So how are we going to measure that, and how are we going to make sure that it's actually making an impact with the repeal of Section 7AA?
So I guess I just make 2 points, which is one, really repeating an earlier point, that the practice changes we've made, we believe, hang strongly on the legislation that remains. But to your point, the work that we have done in our quality assurance space gives us a really strong baseline of how we understand practice has changed over the last number of years. So it will also be attuned to whether practice continues to improve, or whether we see changes that move us away from the outcomes that we want for children and young people. And we a lot of our quality assurance information we put into the public domain for exactly the point that you made. We absolutely, the impact we have on the lives of children and families is significant. We should be open and transparent about that. And so we'll continue to make more of that evidence and insight obvious and visible.
We'll now move to topic number 6 in the structured agenda, which is Oranga Tamariki Public Sector Leadership and working with other entities. I'll kick this off. The Children's Act 2014 identifies 6 children agencies. In addition to Oranga Tamariki, the children's agencies are the New Zealand Police, Ministries of Education, Social Development, Health and Justice. The committee notes the findings of the role Oranga Tamariki has in relation to the Oranga Tamariki Action Plan and its leadership role of the children's system. Can you describe what engagement Oranga Tamariki has had with the other children's agencies to inform the recent contracting round, particularly in relation to prevention services?
That looks like me. So look, we have, we do have a leadership role across the Oranga Tamariki Action Plan agencies and the broader children's system. And actually, we've been working really closely, particularly with our focus on outcomes, and also with the social investment agency. My view is there's still some more work that needs to be done, but actually how we're looking at working across agencies is to make sure that we are aligning our social investment, recognising that the outcomes we seek from the system are actually not just Oranga Tamariki interventions, but also in the more broader context in terms of the contribution from education, health and such like. Darren, anything you wanted to add?
No, probably also our joint work across the family violence, sexual violence area, and Te Puna Aonui. So we're working part of the Te Aotearoa Kuta strategy. Our work has been, we will be focusing more on a multi-agency approach, so how to work with other government agencies across so as part of that action plan that'll get announced shortly around there, to be how we work closer around our fast track tables, our MDCAT tables, how we also might get better involvement and better results as an agency, as a community of agencies around sexual violence and family violence, where children may be exposed to that. So that's part of the broader pieces of work. We've also undertaken, the Ministry of Health have undertaken an assessment and a review of gateway assessments, which is about services where children get access to key services, etc., and do the assessments. So that part is underway. We're also reviewing some of the work that we're doing around SWIS, which is services, our social workers in schools, so we'll get a better understanding around there, what value that work is doing around some of the earlier things that you were raising. So that's us.
Just a supplementary on that from me, just around the social investment agency aspect of it. So this is Oranga Tamariki going to be leaning into its work on the prevention aspect?
Oh, look, 100%. I think that, where the lens that the social investment agency is bringing is actually more of that system-wide lens. Much of our conversation today, I think, has kind of been burrowed into, and maybe rightly so, into the Oranga Tamariki contribution. what the Social Investment Agency is helping us to understand all of the interventions that are available in the first 2,000 days. For example, starting to focus on where there's evidence, whether there's outcome, and particularly in terms of the IDI data set, whether people are actually better in relation as a result of those interventions. So really leaning in strongly to that.
So our big strength would be on outcomes. So our social investment approach is what better outcomes. There's a question you raised earlier about how we would measure that. So some of the work that we're doing at the moment that's already underway is how would we measure better outcomes to children themselves that are accessing these services. So we do annual reviews all the time that tell us things. But if we were commissioning and contracting or buying different services, how do we know that those outcomes are producing better outcomes to tamariki children and young people in our services? So that work will inform what we're going to be purchasing coming out in the next year, or how we might measure better what we're doing. So at a social investment approach, it's better outcomes is better value for our money, and then investing in those sorts of things there that we know will get the results that we're looking for.
Supplementary, Dana.
Thank you. I'm just interested in that concept in terms of the regional aspect, and particularly in towns in my area of the country, such as Aotearoa, Gisborne, Kawerau, Murupara. Because what we know is that in Gisborne, for example, something like $1.2 million being spent in social agencies delivering, but we're not aware of what the outcomes are that are being achieved in a cross-agency perspective. So are you able, and particularly in the prevention of some of the intergenerational issues that we face going forward, so how soon do you think this work is actually going to be completed and start delivering? Because every day, we carry on, but we need to do it as a priority.
We haven't got a schedule yet as to when that region. So what I understand is that they will stand up different kind of multi-agency responses over time, over the next year to 2 years. So I'm not too sure when it'll come into that region. I do know that the two that they're thinking about partnering, I better not announce it. I'll leave that one here.
Come on,
Yeah, but so
you can tell me later.
Yeah, I'll tell you later. It's not your area anyway. But anyway,
Must be mine.
yeah. But those are, and of course, it's a learn as you go process. So if we're going to stand it up, what will work from that? What were some of the barriers, so that as they start to scale out. Again, remembering that Oranga Tamariki is just part of that system. It's a part of a wider system. So at the stage around the family violence ones, it'll be Te Puna Aonui that be helping to guide the programming of that pieces of work. But the different agencies are committed. Andrew, as the chief executive, and Nimbo chief executive, sit on the board that will make those decisions out in that. So I can't comment any further on that one.
Sovereignty, Paolo.
Thank you for providing us with information about Gateway. My question has to do with the fact that Oranga Tamariki, as it sharpens its focus on health education and housing outcomes for our young people. What practical steps do you see yourselves doing as you go into the next year? In terms of refocusing on housing, education, and
It is, as it relates to strategic intentions.
Yeah. Go.
Consistent.
Yep.
I was just going to fill in by giving you a practical example.
Oh, no. We just gathered ourselves. Darren took us a bit off track. So look, that cross-agency space is really important. And my view is we've spread ourselves a bit too thinly, had a big long list of things, and very hard to see the focus. Where we're focusing on in terms of a more narrow focus in the coming year is around mental health training for frontline kaimahi and caregivers. Also recognising that mental health, in terms of Tasha's comments earlier, is a real feature in terms of youth offending in our youth justice area. So we're working really hard with our mental health colleagues around what can we be doing to shift the dial in that space. The second point is I think we have been guilty as a system of having a lot of focus Wellington-centric, which is good at a policy level. What we're doing is actually driving the relationships and the collaborations down to the regional level. That's really clear in a couple of ways, but the one I want to flag to you is in terms of our approach to youth offending around how we intervene early. What we're finding is that in those homes and households where there is youth offending, attending school, having a home that's healthy, having kai on the table are some of the underlying factors. In terms of the regional tables that have been set up and are rolling out, we've got other agencies with boots on the ground that are sitting around those tables. And my final comment is around our org change and org design. So just to bring that back into the conversation is that with our new operating model, we've really enhanced our thinking around leadership in terms of the leadership across the regions, making sure our regional commissioners are able to work with the regional public service leads, how we might coordinate our response, but most importantly, get the right responses into those homes and actually get the right, as quick as possible response between police and Oranga Tamariki, Housing New Zealand, MSD. So that's where we're focusing, and we are focusing hard on that.
And I was just going to add just very briefly off the back of the Gateway Review. One of the things that the Gateway Review really helpfully did was spotlight a couple of regional areas where, they'd moved away from the complexity of Gateway and done some really neat and innovative things. So, for example, in Auckland, attaching the dental service to the Gateway process, because we know dental health is a really significant issue for children who come into care. And other areas creating fit-for-purpose community spaces rather than the clinical environments where children usually come to see a paediatrician. All of these things help with access, with making it easier for families to support their children to get these important services. So I think there's the ability to not overcomplicate those local solutions, but enable them is a really important part of how we continue to work moving forward.
Only supplementary.
Oh, sorry, mine's a primary.
Oh, right. Maro supplementary.
Oh, okay.
You've got supplementary as well.
Yeah, we've had it in phases.
I'm going in order.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
I beat Jenny, by the way. But
A
No,
little bit attached to the Gateway conversation, because certainly my memory, when we used to talk about kids being caught in the churn, and Gateways was often where it kind of got stopped, and I wondered, and I can hear the ideas and, working towards. Are you confident that at a workforce on the ground capability to do the assessment? Because we used to sit in rooms and like, well, who's going to do it? And there was such a line. So there's can you just, in summary anyway, just share more confidence, give some confidence about whether that's.
I mean, I think there are a number of processes along the Gateway process that can make it hard for kids to get that when in the best time. So it's not one thing, it's everything. It's making it easier to explain what a gateway is to families, so it's something that they want to agree to, because consent's a big issue. It is about where we hold those kind of processes, but it is, I think, there probably are.
Nicola, is there any suicide prevention, any of that inside this Gateway?
Gateway's a holistic assessment of health, so it includes mental health as well.
Yeah.
And look, I think you're talking to, this conversation is about the Gateway was put in place at a moment in time, and it's been a number of years. And I think you're dead right. As part of the review, and I've got to be careful to not do any pre-announcements of anything, but it's being considered at the moment.
Come on, drop us a
is one around how you shorten the distance between referral and getting that response.
Yes.
And actually some of that sits within primary care, not waiting on a sort of a wait list for Gateway. And there's been a lot more resource going to primary care in the mental health space. So what we're looking at is just around how we might reset or tighten up our system, because it's there's no use a child or whānau waiting, 6 months to see a paediatrician when it's something that could just be done and get that need. So that's the way we're thinking about it. I think there's still some work to do. I think getting the right people to the table, I think is a challenge for the system, but we're working hard on that.
And I think your question was quite pointed, which is around, clearly, around what's the capability build to support that, to enable that to happen. And probably to bring to your attention as well, of course, you led a lot of that children's work services for us up into Taitokerau for a long time, bringing health, education, all of those different services. So I think the clear question, to be honest, to respond to you, is that we need to build that capability. So to refer this down to regions without building the capability on there, as you know, is no easy task. You have to bring the right people around together, and then we need to be able to assess what the needs are in that area.
Thank you.
Supplementary.
Thank you. Mine is just one sup on this. And it's trying to understand this collaborative approach. And also some of the minister's responses to questions this year has been around not everything is the responsibility of Oranga Tamariki, and that other departments, other agencies, other ministers have a responsibility. And I have been trying to find out who's responsible for what and who has allocated money for what, that together collectively all the needs are being met. I'm having some difficulty with that, so maybe it's the way I'm asking my question, but if you can show us from your conversations that you've been having who's doing what, that would be helpful, particularly around funding things, because that's what's not clear to us. My concern, and I want to know if you are concerned, is when we asked the Ministry of Justice as a children's agency what they're doing, they came back and said that they are not a children's agency. But they are clearly one of the named children's agencies in your group and legislation.
Now, your last part of the question, I'm sorry, I lost the first part of the question. Could you just...
It's really just the last part. I've got the Ministry of Justice saying to me, no answer to my question because we're not a children's agency.
No, you're something you asked about the funding support. You want to get your thing.
So you've been talking about gateways. I'm talking about, in addition to that, who is funding what and what services that meet the needs of children.
Right, okay.
Yeah. And I'm trying to understand what Justice might be doing. And I've asked all the other children's agencies as they are listed, and they've come back and said, we are not a children's agency. So what does that say about the collective system?
Well, probably what it says is that actually we need some reset with Justice, and we need to have a conversation there, right? So that's just straight off the bat. The second question is around, I think you're talking about funding gaps, where there are issues that occur, and actually understanding funding gaps. This is not a new conversation. I've been working in health and across social services for the best part of 33 years. This is a real challenge for us. Even more so, it's not just a challenge for families and whānau, it's also a challenge for NGOs trying to work out where they, our community providers around where, where they might refer particular individuals to. So I think there is an issue here we're trying to work through as a system. So I don't have a panacea answer, but what I can say is the areas where we have known gaps, and there's two that I want to talk about. It's one in the mental health space, right? So we have our frontline social workers that will say, look, we identify a mental health need, and actually we don't think this is Oranga Tamariki's, well, we don't think we're actually trained or skilled to respond to that mental health need. And you might have mental health services saying that we don't think that the level of need is as great as to be referred in. So that's the reason we're working closely with mental health to say, look, there is a gap. How do we close the gap? And for mental health, the good example is that there has been a lot, and I touched on this before, a lot of investment into primary level mental health services. And I think there's work that we need to do to ensure that our social workers are aware and our community partners are aware around of where these services are, one. We need to work with mental health to ensure that they are stepping in when referrals come in. And personally, I would like to see our young people even prioritised for response, just to recognise where they're coming from, what they need. That's my own view. It's not a cross-agency, but just a Phil Grady view. And then what we also want to do is put escalation pathways. So when there is an issue that someone is not getting service, that is then escalated, and then we can deal with it and get the most quick response. So that's an example of where we're practically working. The other area just touch on very lightly is also in the disability space. So again, from our frontline social workers, from carers, and also from our partner providers, actually understanding who is responsible clearly for disability is something we're giving our attention to, specifically in terms of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, learning disabilities, and such like. And so that is at the nexus of our focus. So that is discussions between ministers. I'm working, as are my colleagues, across agency with, particularly with MSD. Now there's been a change from Waikaha, because we need to work through these fundamental questions, and most importantly, that we get the right services to those in need.
So just in terms of that example that you gave, I was concerned when Waikaha said, this is not our responsibility, this is education. But when questioned, had education then made the appropriation to pick up the thing that Waikaha was no longer doing, I'm worried that we may have the same situation with Oranga Tamariki, who's now saying this is not actually what we should be doing, it should be somebody else. So before cutting something, are we ensuring that something else is in place so there isn't an actual hole and gap?
Yeah, so, so just to be clear, we are working with a cross-agency group. I sit on that cross-agency group with education, with health, to actually work through these very issues. That when there has been a change in the system, I too, I don't think there's anyone in the room who want to have created gaps in the system. And equally running alongside that is that we've got the operational issues, as well, I call them operation issues, but issues as they come out when there might be a service gap, that there's a clear line and pathway for those managers with operational responsibility to raise that directly within MSD. There's still some work to do, but those things are in place.
And it would be fair to say we still meet costs that are related to health, education and disability. We're just much more transparent about having those conversations with agencies about filling gaps that
That's
exist.
good to hear, because when we heard it with Waikaha, that wasn't the
And
case.
what's the name of the cross-agency group? What's that called? Does it have a name?
So we've got a Oranga Tamariki Action Plan cross-agency group, and then we've got the CEs meet in terms of the social sector, and we've also got so Jenny, go into a range of kind of, so there's a cross-agency group that's working on Gateway, there's a cross-agency group working on disability, and we've got an emerging cross-agency group working on, sorry, that was clicking my fingers to get my brain working, working on mental health.
Okay.
But ultimately it's led out, and I think, Willow Jean, to your point, it's led out by the social sector CEs, and that's where that accountability sits. And then, to the best of my knowledge, and I believe this to be true, is that the CE for Justice sits on, as far as I know, sits on that group. But I can go away and check that.
Yeah. Was that yours?
Yeah, hopeful.
Thank you for the information about social investment. I think that's really exciting. And you two pilots sound exciting too. When you spoke about outcomes, so trying to get sort of better social outcomes through using IDI and using the social investment agency, does Oranga Tamariki do that work to identify what those outcomes, and are they similar to the ones in your annual report, or is that something that the social investment agency puts into their magic computer and produces for you?
Yeah, look, I think this is a work in progress, right? So there are different outcomes across each cohort, but what we do internally, so we have a team that's focused on performance and outcomes. We take a lot of the data, so in terms of the provider information they provide us in terms of contracting, Many of that, much of that contract reporting actually goes into the IDI database, so we can sort of look at whether we're getting the outcomes over time from the services that we fund. And we're looking at, with the Social Investment Agency around how do we get outcomes more broadly as a system and the interventions that go with that. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the way we're thinking about it.
And kind of, could you give me a rough idea about the time frame of an outcome? Is it sort of like a budget cycle from your point of view, or would it be a longer period of time?
We'll probably be looking at a longer horizon and a more proximal horizon. So if you think about in terms of our annual report, what we're focusing in there in terms of appropriation measures is kind of things that we can count on top of our sometimes difficult internal CSIRO systems and such like. So we're focusing there. In terms of where we're trying to get in terms of strategic intentions is actually to have a longer cycle, to actually be thinking about not just annually, but actually across a period of time and working with our partner providers on focusing on more longer term outcomes. I think there's an important note that the work that Darren's leading out around enabling communities actually starts to really get into that space around the more longer term outcomes for earlier interventions. And then with the social investment agencies, what are the outcomes we want as a system?
And so those contractors who have already had a return of investment analysis, would you be looking at those to identify who's going to get a contract, who's best to serve a contract? Does that analysis feed into how you select who's the best to provide in that community?
So yes and yes is the answer to that question. So yes, we're doing some analysis. I think we need to do some better analysis. So I think there's something in this space that is really important as we think about social investment, which is starting to look at across cohorts and age groups around all of the interventions that go into that. And we need to be mindful, actually, there's I guess a triangle we need to be thinking about. What does the IDI say? What are we getting in terms of our providers' response, but also understanding what is the stories and the experience both from our partner providers and also those that are using service. And that's what we need to work through.
And if I could just add to that, the missing piece is how we turn what we know about individual outcomes for children, which is buried away in our current case management system. And it's very hard for us to be able to tell that story in a joined up way that actually enables us to triangulate, okay, how are the kids in Aotearoa or Whakatane or whatever going, and how does that relate to the experiences of the providers as well? So the work that we have underway to address our CSIRO case management system has multiple benefits, obviously benefits to time for social workers and things I could talk a long time about, which I won't, but it also has direct benefits to the accountability about what are the overall outcomes for children as well.
So you
Just supplement before I go there. No, I'm going to ask this first.
Really important.
Please. For the chair.
Yeah, you're the chair.
I just want clarity and answer that question from Jenny before. You said yes and yes. Did you mean yes and yes or yes and no?
No, I need to go back to the question around when I said yes and no. But I think what we might be, what I'm grappling with in the conversation, and I think this is not a new conversation for government, it's not a new conversation for agencies. What are the outcomes that we want, and then how do we track back to the interventions and that intervention leading to the outcome? So that's what I was grappling with in the answer.
And I think it's part of your question though, is the what do we want before we go to the who?
Yeah.
And people are starting with the who and you haven't identified the what.
Yeah.
And that's why we're having to have a look first of all at outcomes. If we are really honest, we've been measuring outputs. We've been measuring deliverables against volumes, against targets. That's not going to get us where we need to go. We need to think overall about what the outcome is, short term, and the outcome long term. And then we need to decide that. At the same time that we're commissioned to do some work around a better outcomes or indicators around better outcomes, and we're focused clearly on children, be clear about that, rather than on providers or things, the focus has to start. And then the next question naturally then has to be the who. Who are best to deliver them? So if you're thinking that Oranga Tamariki requires services, but we don't believe that just purchasing services is our future state, We actually have to purchase strong leadership into communities. And that's why we're looking at prototyping with iwi and hapu communities. It won't be just services. It's going to be leading that whole sector about what is best for children and prevention before we even get there by building. So we're having to have a long view while we're also addressing the immediate needs now.
Last up, there's Jenny.
Thank you. And what I think I heard you say was lived experience or individual examples that Oranga Tamariki or other providers are aware of that have worked positively will be overlaid into a data-driven analysis.
Yeah, we need to be able to lift that and be able to tell a more population-wide story that links directly to those individual experiences.
New question, Laura.
Sorry, and then the IDI then also starts to then not just look at the Oranga Tamariki view. And Willow Jean, I think, this is to your question, which is actually what were the educational inputs, what were the mental health inputs, and what are the outcomes? And actually you can start looking at the broader system. So I think this is quite an exciting, you can hear that I'm quite excited about it, but I think this, we can really get some shifts with this approach.
New question, Laura.
Yes, and my question is about caregivers. And if we look at the annual report and the survey that you prepare as to how well people feel placed and supported when they take children into their care, the satisfaction sits over the last 3 years, 50, 49%, 46%. And often I think about the type of issues that are coming to me in my role. And a lot of those frustrations from carers around not having the supports in place from Oranga Tamariki, or that their views are just not being heard when it comes to the children that they have in their care. So my question to you will be, what work have you done around this and how are you going to improve it?
Yeah. So this is absolutely a very clear priority. It's one of our 21 priority focus areas. There has been work done already to try and strengthen support to caregivers. And what I've just kind of showed, the survey shows kind of a disconnect between individual caregivers feeling quite well supported by their individual caregiver social workers, but that the resources that they need to provide the support, that's where that low rate gets to. It becomes things that are really basic and practical, like having caregivers' views around really what people would think are normal day-to-day decisions, but there is some complexity in guardianship decisions, and we've made that a little bit more complicated than we need to for our social workers. So one of the areas of work is really to clarify in our existing practice settings how important it is to be clear right up front what decisions parents are comfortable caregivers making, what decisions social workers might need to be involved in, all of those kind of things, the key points along the decision-making process that caregivers should absolutely be sought, and just trying to simplify some of those small but significant things, like when caregivers want to travel with children, we sometimes make that more difficult than it needs to. So we have a comprehensive work plan that's around that, and we will be providing further advice if we think that there's more needed to strengthen that response beyond what we're already working on in our current practice.
Okay. Supplementary data.
Thank you. My question is also about caregivers, but it's about the approval of caregivers prior to children being placed into their care. And I note, in taking your comments earlier about 80% isn't good enough and we should be aiming at 100%. And I note that you are aiming at 100%, but the fact that we are still at 80% of some children going into homes that have not been provisionally or completely approved doesn't seem adequate in this space, particularly given things that have happened in the past, and it's the worst possible outcome if something goes wrong at that point, because they haven't been approved. So what is being done, and is this a priority for you? How is it being addressed? Because it doesn't seem that anything less than 100% is good enough.
So look, I'll hand over to Rachel, but it is one of our priorities, absolutely, and we've got to get to 100%. So there's no question about that. Perhaps I hand over to Rachel.
And it is an absolute priority for us. So the caregiver approval process is a bit cumbersome, as you'd expect it to be, right? It's a very high standard to ensure that safety is at the forefront, and the people who are putting themselves forward to care are able to do that in a safe way. So it is a bit of an elongated process, and it includes every every household member over the age of 18. So what we do sometimes see, which is adding to the timeframes that you're talking about, is where a new family member or a new person moving into the home. So that automatically becomes like an unapproved placement. Because we've actually got to do the approval for the new person coming in. So all efforts are going to be made to be making sure that we are on target with this, that the caregivers themselves understand what needs to occur, that the relationship between the caregiver social worker, which is a really incredibly important role to support the caregivers, and the children's social worker are working in collaboration with each other to make sure that we can actually get the approval process done and that the placement of the child is stable. And so that we're not in a situation of having to move that child. So,
and given that the balance of what's best for the child is always at the centre of this, I'm assuming, given that, is it most likely that you would place them into a caregiver's home that was approved before one that wasn't? Or how do you actually make that assessment?
yeah, I mean, many times a child will be placed with a wider whānau member, right? And so they may not have initially put themselves up to be a caregiver in the context that you might consider being sort of in a foster parenting kind of relationship. So they're probably very familiar with the child. They know a lot about the child, and the intent is obviously that we can get approval from them and for them rather to be having that child placed with them. So there, as I said, it's a pretty strenuous process to be worked through. Got to work closely with the whānau, all members of that household, to ensure that we can get through the approval process. So every effort is to ensure that there's the right placement for the child right from the outset.
Whatever be the last supplementary on this, Madam.
In the
No, sorry.
in the safety domain,
Yes.
which I get, obviously, how does cultural safety, how is that considered in this thing called safety?
I can speak to that. So one of the things that we are introducing as part of our practice approach is...
Can I just, sorry, just before they do.
Yeah.
No, I'm getting back to you, is because it came back to a statement you made, Nicolette, which was about one of the biggest things that shows up and often is the not belonging.
Yes.
And belonging to what,
Yes.
you know?
Yes.
Or belonging, fundamentally
Yes.
belonging, which is, so yeah,
Yes.
and that, with that end.
So we have, as part of introducing our practice approach, introduced a new framework that underpins our assessment. We've called it Te Puna Oranga. What it looks at is saying we're involved because there's a really serious safety concern about a child. That's the small frame. That's often where we've stopped. We've looked at that. We haven't looked beyond that.
Yeah.
What we're teaching our social workers to do is not lose sight of that, because that's critically important, but to step out and look at a range of other domains. So we're talking about emotional wellbeing. We're talking about cultural wellbeing, wider we're talking about the environment, the whānau, and actually that way of contextualising safety and risk. In my experience as a social worker, and I've been in the organisation for a very long time, has allowed us both to be much more focused on safety than we have in the past, but also to open ourselves up to a much broader range of responses within whānau, within hapu, within community to that safety. It is landing with our social workers in a way that I haven't seen something land before, and we're using it to inform our caregiver assessment, our assessments of reports of concern. And again, it's a journey, but it is something that is connecting to understanding that you can both stay really focused on safety, but think about it in that holistic, broader way. In connection, belonging, identity, and the long-term wellbeing of our young people, absolutely is fundamental to their wellbeing. When they leave our care, where do they go to? Yeah. And we need them to have that sort of strong sense of who they are and where they belong.
Thank you.
Right, we're on our last topic, which is general questions, current events, including observations regarding prior years' budget initiatives, funds, what has been achieved with that money, and how it is reported.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. There is a question that I have been trying to get an answer to from the Minister since the last hearing, and that information has not been forthcoming, even though it has been promised. And it is, how much per participant is the boot camp pilot?
I think that's June, as it relates to June 2024.
Well, they'll know how much it is. They would have appropriated it and are spending it as we speak.
I don't have that information on me, need to go back to the office.
So, well, then how can my subsequent question be answered, which is this the best value? Is the boot camp the best value for money? But you haven't been able to tell me how much it is per participant, and we haven't been able to do a comparison between other programs like Kotahi Te Whakaaro and the boot camp when I asked those questions earlier. In terms of the appropriation, the objectives that the department has, the money that is being expended, the results that we are hearing in even today, is this the best spend in youth justice?
Well, if we haven't got the figures here, we'll get the figures back to you in terms of the, the cost of a pilot and then the breakdown and how that's attributed to individuals. I mean, at the end of the day, this is still a pilot. So, some of those questions you've asked, we won't know the answer to until the pilot's finished. But we'll definitely, you've asked the question in terms of the money, we'll get back to you.
And my final question on that, and then I'll let others have the rest of the time, is it goes to the point that Tamitha Paul made earlier regarding this. There is legislation going through the House to entrench the boot camps, to scale this up, and the pilot hasn't even been completed, and we don't actually know what the costs per participant are. Is this financially affordable? And is it giving the results that we would expect for the level of investment that is being made? And I want to be really clear, I am advocating for significant investment in youth justice. I am not convinced from today that we are seeing the money being put in the right place.
Firstly, I'd like to apologise because I should have had that information, and we have got a detailed breakdown, so apology from me. In relation to your absolute question that need to be answered around value for money, I think to the CE's position, we are in pilot. We've got the first process, draft evaluation now, but we really will have to go further into it, and to your point, do those comparisons as well. So I'm sure, in another several months, we will be in a stronger position for that. We're just in transition, but we're not backing away from your question. But we do need a pilot as a pilot. Some things are going to work, some things are not, and we'll ensure that we're doing that comparison and working, and also bring it into the design.
Supplementary Maromino.
Just to thank you for that, Tish. So in a several months, would you, and it's related to the question of the pilot still to be, shown its worth, I guess, and then evaluation of that, which will take time. But there is already the threat that it's gonna land, not this, but the legislation will land in any case. Do you think that's a smart idea? Because we don't know enough about whether it's good or not. Other than anecdotal, though important, but they're anecdotal and it's way early. So do you think that's a smart idea?
In as much as this is against the organisation's progress against the Australian contentions.
Yeah, what he said.
When I say that, the MSA was always 12 months, remember, and it had the various components. And we literally hot off the press have got a sort of draft evaluation, which is under consideration. If we look at those parts, the assessment, the pre-assessment, and the academy part, well, that does allow us to do a comparison of some knowns. Like we have comparable other units with our young serious offenders, so we could start looking at that. The transition part, though, will just take a little bit longer, but we hear you. We will be answering those questions as best we can for the comparison. We just can't answer it right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
New question, Kaorangi.
Thank you. So the Manawa Kupuna OPCAT monitoring report identified evidence of ill treatment, degrading or inhumane punishment at Hikitea, breaching the United Nations Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. As the lead agency for Children's Agency under the Children's Act, 2014. How has Oranga Tamariki worked across government to address these breaches and ensure accountability and protections for tamariki, particularly those with disabilities?
Well, that's in relation to the Aotearoa bill. It's in relation to the Hakatea. It was relation to the Hakatea report that was released this week.
Yes, so just to clarify the question.
Yes, absolutely.
Was it Hakatea?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
So it's our system role in response to the findings made by Mana Mokopuna in relation to Hakatea,
Yes.
I think was the question.
Basically, te whatuora saying,
Right.
So again, in as much as this is the organisation's progress against your strategic intentions, and as it relates to
Only
this.
just
Look,
understanding that report
Look,
ourselves.
that is a relatively new report. We're still working to understand it. We will certainly work with Mana Mokopuna as part of our ongoing relationship to understand what has gone on there and also to work with health. But I think fundamentally, what this highlights is that we should not have ill treatment of children and young people in any facility up and down the country. And I think Mana Mokopuna's report calls this out clearly.
Yeah, and so I guess I want to know how Oranga Tamariki is acting decisively and holding
health.
health to account. And these are serious breaches of tamariki rights identified in this report. So, what are we going to implement at the system level that are actually going to make sure that we prevent this kind of ill treatment that goes against, our UN obligations to human rights, especially for disabled tamariki?
Yeah, look, do you want to make some comments in that space? Or?
I mean, I think that's a really good question that you raise. We obviously are really accountable when findings are made in residents that we're responsible for. I think actually it is a really pertinent question in terms of our children's systems leadership role in relation to the report that you've just released. I think we've got to do some more thinking about that. So thank you for raising it. What I do think it speaks to, though, is some of the, and obviously these are under active consideration, but we are an active part of the Crown agencies that are considering what we can do within our current response in response to the Royal Commission. And it is about having kind of consistent care standards and principles across all of our care settings. And obviously we are concerned for any setting for a child to be harmed. But I think you've raised a really good challenge for us to take back as an agency, actually.
I've just got one more question. So I guess, in relation to the Royal Commission of Inquiry that you're talking about, have you been having discussions in this last year about legislation changes that go against the report's recommendations?
Look.
Because you've brought up the Royal Commission of Inquiry and that it's important to you to honour it. So have you had these discussions about where legislation goes against recommendations?
So look, we're in thinking about those discussions now. So just recognising timing. The report released the CEOs in terms of the apology. This is now work that's happening around what do we need to change across the system, both looking at going forward and also recognising the historic abuse. And our thinking around legislation needs to be on the table there.
Yeah, this is a
new question, Jenny.
example of history repeating.
I've just got a couple of wash-up ones. First of all, do you intend to do a social investment analysis of military style academies?
Well, so look, we will not be able to get a social investment analysis around the military style academies for some time, right? So and this I think goes to the earlier question, some of the earlier conversation is actually the outcome for these individuals will actually not be known for some time. Our evaluation, rolling a series of evaluations is actually focusing on one, what are the process outcomes? Two, what are the outcomes that we can track? And over time, absolutely, we need to be looking around whether this and other interventions are the right intervention. And I think also just then thinking more broadly is around where across that continuum of need do we invest in further?
So there are multiple NGOs that have been given a strong indication by the government that there is an expectation that they go and get a return of investment analysis done, predominantly by Impact Lab, at a cost of $30,000. They've gone and done that work. Impact Lab have done 300 to date. They've got access to the IDI as a private entity, and that's $9 million. So if Impact Lab and NGOs have been able to generate 300 return on investment analyses for those to get funding, why can't Oranga Tamariki do the same analysis for boot camps?
Look, so for the military style, just to, and I'll pass over to Tasha, you can't get an IDI outcomes analysis for something that is happening today. The analysis I think you're talking about, and I can't speak for the Impact Lab, the side of things, is actually on a range of services that have been in place for a longer period of time, looking at those individuals that have received the services and what are the outcomes. I think there are two different things we're talking here, but we won't know the outcomes for those individuals from the military style academy for some period of time.
So
Wait, and then Tasha? No, I was just going to ask Tasha.
Oh, okay, you can talk about that. Oh, so apologies, I've got some more information here.
So-
More information.
No, have you got?
However, we have been in negotiations with Impact, or had conversations with them earlier when we were in design prior to set up, to ask that very question around how we look at that social investment approach, so we can come back to the table.
Impact Lab. Sorry.
So you would use Impact Lab to do that assessment?
No, I'm not saying we would use it, but we have had a conversation and we are looking a bit to Phil's point. We then looked internally to see what we could do, so.
And so would you engage them to do that work? Is that what you're saying? You're having conversations with them?
No, what we're saying is, we thought from the outset that we need to have a social investment approach going forward. So I had a conversation and then we talked internally about what we could do to look at it.
All right, we have time for
With
one last
Impact
question
Lab.
is Paolo.
With Impact Lab.
My question has to do with youth justice family group conferences and what you're seeing happening in this space. What are your expectations from it? And ultimately, are you seeing good outcomes?
When Youth Justice Family Group Conference happen early, when they involve family, when they involve a really good assessment of need, and the right kind of options and pathways, when they involve the participation of victims, they have a huge contribution to make in outcomes for young people. What we know is that as young people with more complex offending backgrounds, for a range of reasons, progress into more serious offending, we need to be thinking about what else we bring to the table, and we need to be deepening the strength of our social work responses. We need to be ensuring that we have the right sets of interventions, and we have, I think the current focus on youth justice is helpful, as I said earlier, to make sure that at whatever point of offending we begin to work with the young person, we have the right set of responses. So that does take us back to things like Te Kotahi Te Whakaaro and Fast Track, which are programs that are underway and active in working with families now with really great results in terms of, for our youngest offenders, 75% not having a second, I think that's right, 70%, sorry. And the ability this year to extend that to the older age group who are having that emerging offending behaviour, that's really, really important. Youth justice, FGC practice generally is a focus for us in terms of improving the quality of FGCs. Like anything, something can become a process and lose its effectiveness. So one of the things that we've invested in and will be providing and have implemented this year is training specifically around youth justice family group conference practice for our social workers and coordinators.
Well, that concludes our hearing today. So I want to thank you all very much for hearing before the committee today. I think we've seen the passion of members and of yourselves, and I'm sure it's reflected throughout your organisation this great care and importance of the young people in Tamariki and Mokopuna in this country. Thank you for the hard work you're doing. There's a lot more to do, obviously.
Well, Chair and Committee, look, thank you very much for your time. These are actually really helpful. You know, it enables us to do a big deep dive. I mean, I'm not saying it's the most comfortable way to spend a Friday, but I do want to say that, you know, there's a huge amount of preparation that's gone on. You've done a lot of research. The questions have been really rigorous, and that's what the system needs. So thank you very much.
Thank you.